Clementine had a hard time meeting Troy's eyes the next morning. Thankfully, though, she wasn't the one to wake him, as she moved back over towards the dying fire in the middle of the night where she slept. She didn't want to have to deal with him when he finally awoken again, so she chose to leave him for now, keep watch from another location. Jane was the first girl to awake, though Clementine could be for sure she truly went back to sleep after Troy's confessions last night. The girl was almost sure of herself that she had chosen to stand sentry around the camp because of how much his words bothered her. Seeing a human pained side to someone she only seen as a monster was very recently and was startling. She could only wonder how Jane felt, having to meet the man in the earlier time. Colton and Kylie had been gone by the time she arrived, for Luke's group never mentioned them. Did Jane see a big distinction between Troy and she'd first encountered at Howe's? And who was he now? And this was difference ever since measurable? A sigh escaped through the lips as she reminded herself that it didn't matter. At the end, Troy was sharing his past and didn't change a damn thing, except for maybe how Clementine regarded him. But what others, though, is the worth virtuality. Nothing in a world where survival isn't guaranteed. Once more seeming to zone out, she almost didn't notice Nick sitting up nearby. A sleepy smile formed on his lips. Rubbing at his eyes, he rasped, "Morning, Clem. You look real tired." Scrunching his eyebrows, the man did seem to connect a few dots in his head and asked, "Did you sleep all last night?" Sheepishly, she shrugged. Someone had to keep watch. It was a poor excuse. She couldn't help but the way her eyes drifted over towards Troy's still unconscious form a few feet from the fence. She had dragged him at the edge of the chain links, and just in case if any walkers got hungry in the night. Nick's face soured. Wasn't Troy supposed to be watch after Kenny? Did the dumbass forget or something? He scoffed, leaning back towards the logs in the encircling of the fire. Clementine shook her head. No, he did his shift. I just took over afterwards. Troy's secrets weren't hers to blab, so she wasn't keen on letting anyone know about them. Besides, some small part of her felt a bit untouched when he had trusted her enough to let it out. It was probably because of the alcohol, but still. Troy was making progress nonetheless. Gotcha. Well, we should probably get moving soon, huh? Nick murmured, nudging Luke beside him. Rise and shine, man. The sleeping man groaned slightly, shifting onto his side before his eyes snapped open, and he sat up. Morning, Clem, Nick. Luke nodded to each of them, poking lightly at Sarah nearby. The girl stirred and shifted into a seated position next to them, yawning and adjusting her glasses. Morning, everyone, she whispered, her voice still sleepy. Is, everyone feeling a bit better than last night? Her hands dug into her jacket, fishing her piece of rope out of for reference. Clementine could feel the weight of hers in her own pocket, and found herself nodding in response. I do a little, she admitted. It was nice to do. Everyone I liked it too. Me too, Luke added. It really helps put things in perspective. Made me think that no one was really gone, that they're always going to be with us now. He paused to chuckle, a nervous sort of edge to his voice. Guess that sounded a little cheesy. Sarah brightened by the words. No, it doesn't at all. I promise. I'm glad I helped. I needed to. Good, thanks for your brightening up the mood, Sarah, Nick said with a bright smile on his own. I'm sure we're all still alive out of our original group from the cabin, don't get me wrong. I missed them all so much. He paused and lowered his head as in tribute. But I'm still real grateful that there is 3 of us still together. Me too, man. Though we ain't been any of the polite to Clem here, Luke snickered and rubbed the back of his head nervously. Clementine blinked, smiling a little. It's okay. I know you guys have a bond, just like me and Kenny, from when we traveled together. Yeah, it doesn't make you any less important, Clem, Sarah exclaimed. In fact, you're pretty much my best friend. Friend. The word that sent a warning of unease through Clementine, but it also quite of a mixture of satisfaction and relief. Just for a moment, Sarah's declaration of friendship made the girl feel normal again, like it was a playground. and she'd been inducted into a secret club. Like she made snow angels with Sarah instead of trudging for a safe house in a half-frozen, to show her a collection of bracelets that she had gathered when we weren't pieces of rope tied in them keep the memories of those they had been brutally killed. Just for a moment, Clementine felt like a normal girl again. Just then, people like this in the world. The thought came and went. She shook her head, bashing the delusions from her mind. What was she thinking? Right now, her focus was getting to the supplies Arvo had promised, and to keep AJ safe, to keep Sarah safe, to help keep Nick, Luke, Kenny, Troy, all the group alive. She kept telling herself the next death wouldn't hurt as much as the last, and while that was partially true, she could never get quite used to the look of lifelessness in their eyes. Her senses were just not mumbled enough to image the corpse, wherever it was walking or not. Hey, Clem, Luke nudged her slightly, noticing she'd gone quiet. You know we're your friends too, and we ain't going nowhere. You can't promise that. She wanted to say it, but it echoed in her head like a drum. It was still the smile of Luke's face that was comforting, and she found herself nodding as if she believed him. Nick took off his hat, running his hand through the messy black hair. We cabin folks gotta stick together like glue, including you, Clem. Yeah, Sarah cheered in agreement. I mean, who else would know how lame and boring the cabin was? Hey, Luke snorted, nudging her a bit. I brought us there, remember? That's the thanks I get? The girl simply nodded. Boring, she repeated with a giggle. Clementine felt herself getting lost in the laughter and playfulness of the conversation. She almost missed Mike finally setting up nearby. He gazed with the amusement, simply watching until they noticed him staring. You guys are awfully chatty, he scoffed lighthearted, rolling over to nudge Bonnie awake. Kenny was surprised to be the last awake besides Troy, but he was the first to stand up and get packed and ready to go, already telling the rest of the group to hurry along. Clementine frowned in disappointment that the small moment had with the remaining cabin members was over, but she knew very much that there was anyone that she needed to keep moving. It was once everyone was stand up and were ready that someone finally noticed the one-armed dumbass near one of the generators, and of course it was Kenny. The older man glanced down at the sleeping figure, giving him a slight kick to the stomach. Hey asshole, wake up! I know you didn't do this shit with Carver. A good point, Clementine reflected, but Troy probably hadn't gotten drunk at Howe's. The younger man groaned and flipped himself over, shooting a glare at Kenny that would show with more malice than Troy could possibly ever see through the words. Still, he kept quiet and stumbled onto his feet, shaking his head and clearing the lasting effects of the alcohol. My head hurts, he mumbled. But no one paid any attention to mind. She couldn't help but cross her arm once more, and he caught her gaze and sighed to herself as she approached him. Good morning, sunshine, she snarked, not being able to resist a huge smirk. He looked, well, Troy was never pretty, but he looked even more of a mess now, with the wrinkled clothes and a brown mop of hair of mess. He scowled and warned at not doing any favors either. She had suppressed a snicker now how crabby he looked. Definitely not a morning person, then, or a hangover person. Stuff it, he snapped with his teeth grinding together. I don't remember what all happened last night, but I know I told you dumb shit. Keep that to yourself and we won't have any problem. You hear? She merely rolled her eyes in response. Why would I want to tell that stuff to someone? It sounded personal, and I'm not a telltale. He snorted. A fucking telltale? What are you? How old are you again? Before she could answer, he shook his head. Never mind. Just keep your trap shut and things won't have to get nasty. His words were serious, and he looked a bit grumpy and hungover, but she could hardly be afraid of him. This wasn't like at Howe's, and he had no power there, and they both knew it. I told you I won't tell. You'll just have to trust me, she remarked, knowing that Troy put his faith into anyone at this point. It was a long shot, but still, it wasn't either of them could argue semantics, like it or not. They were stuck with one another. Troy didn't seem to be able to go anywhere anytime soon, and Clementine was starting to get used to that. Luke called all over the conversation before they could continue. Clem, Troy, we're getting ready to go, all right? Hurry along now. He waved them over, looking quite chippier for however earlier the morning it was. Clementine smiled. The atmosphere was nowhere near cheerful, but she felt like some sort of grim mood was hanging over their heads and had been cleared. Sarah's rope knot activity from the previous night seemed to have rekindled some of the spirits, if only for the reminder that they weren't leaving the dead behind. Not really. Their memories would keep them alive, and their physical mentos would as well. Speaking of, she cast a glance towards where Troy had been sitting the previous night. It seemed like a piece of rope he had thrown onto the ground, the one with 2 knots for Colton and Kylie, was gone. He had pocketed it all after all? She didn't care to ask, but she couldn't help but wonder. Yeah, Troy groaned towards Luke, brushing past her and holding up his hand to his head. Jesus, this hurts like a bitch. He mumbled under his breath, and she knew that he didn't mean his arm. The girl did a quick survey around the group before returning to the others. Kenny, Luke, Nick, and Sarah were standing close near to the entrance to the fence to get moving. Mike and Bonnie were getting Arvo untied near one of the generators, and Jane was waiting impatiently, waiting her by herself. It seemed like everyone was ready to keep the move going. After exchanging a wordless glance with Troy, and they both looked at the rest. "Hope you all got enough sleep," Kenny muttered. "There ain't gonna be much stopping along the way. I hope there won't be any problems. You never know." He cast a glare towards Arvo, who limped over to them with Mike and Bonnie. The Russian teen swallowed hard. I'll lead you there. I swear. For a few hours at most." His voice then shook, and he looked even paler than ever. Clementine nodded with a slight concern. "Are you okay?" Sarah asked him, unknowing her friend's voice thoughts. "You look kinda sick. Do we need to rest a little longer?" "I'm not really tired, but..." Arvo whimpered and frightened gazed towards her. His mind was everywhere else at the moment. Before he shook his head. No, I'm fine." He seemed to be convincing, not only for Sarah and the rest of the group, but himself as well. The older girl flashed him a sympathetic look in response, but said nothing. "He better be fine," Kenny growled, giving the teen a shove towards the front of the fence. Arvo cursed something and rushed under his breath, and shuddered through the pain. Kenny just scoffed him and gave him another push. "He's going to get us to that safe house, or whatever the hell it is, and he is going to get us there before sundown. You got it, Rusky?" Arvo merely nodded miserably, keeping his head low. "You don't gotta be like that, man," Mike murmured, flashing a glare towards Kenny. "Yeah, I do, 'cause who knows what he's planning. Just 'cause he gets there in one piece, kid, or you'll wish you were dead," Kenny growled, clearly not having any arguments. Clementine did, however, catch when he gazed down at AJ, nuzzled in his arms comfortably, for a few moments as if recalling who they were all moving so quickly for. AJ had been given the chance to live, and it wasn't fair otherwise. Trudging through the snow wasn't practically hard for most of them, though both Luke and Arvo seemed to be struggling the most. The latter was leading. However, they had to keep up the pace in fear for Kenny's gun to be pointed at his back. Clementine did not approve, not by a long shot, but she couldn't exactly confront Kenny at the moment. He wouldn't listen anyway, as the man always did what he thought was the best. She huddled closer to herself as they walked on. Troy and Sarah were the closest to her. Troy seemed to be keeping an eye on her, as if to go up to someone and just spill out his secrets. How rude, honestly. While Sarah seemed slightly more confident, she walked along. Eventually, Troy's attention shifted to Sarah. The older girl was holding her gun, an extra from one of the Russians. It was like made of glass. "Don't you remember how to hold it and how to aim?" he asked. Sarah blinked, slowly bringing the pistol up and forward towards the gap of their group. "Behind your elbows a little more. Bend them," Troy said. Carefully, Sarah did as instructed, showing a good stance when to shoot. Troy then nodded his approval, and she beamed and dropped her arms. "Keep it on your belt, and hit that tab when it's back there. Turn on the safety," Troy added, nodding towards the little notch at the back of the gun. Sarah did as instructed, and keeping it safe and secured when she wasn't using it. Thank you," she exclaimed. "I really appreciate the help from you, Mike and Clem. I do hope I don't have to use a gun anytime soon. It seems scary, but I want to be able to protect myself. I want to get stronger." Closing her eyes slightly, Sarah whispered, "It's what my dad would have wanted. I just know it." Clementine forced a small smile. "I think he would want it for you too." Troy merely grimaced. "Don't frickin' frank me for teaching you how the basic shit. I don't want you all coming to me when you got hectic and wanting to me to protect you," he scoffed, adding a bitter tone. "And really, you can all hoping you ain't don't have to use the gun, but you will always find a reason to use it." Sarah frowned, clearly not apprehending his angry words. I know you always seem to have a reason to use a gun, she muttered. The man then raised his eyebrows in surprise, as if he hadn't been expecting sass, and hissed, "Shut up, or I'm going to try and help you out so you don't get bit and we don't have to put you down." Sarah flinched, her confidence dissolving immediately as she shrunk back. She wasn't able to speak right away, gazing over to Clementine for help. The younger girl smacked Troy's side, unafraid of him. Her resolve hardened as she caught his eyes, a warning in her glare. "Stop saying stuff like that. No one's getting bitten." As soon as she was focused back to Sarah, her expression softened. "Don't worry about his changing moods. Troy's just got grumpy, and I think he knows why." Immediately, Troy raised a hand to hit Clementine, but she slapped her eyes back before he could. The hostility in her brown gaze must have made him freeze, and he slowly lowered his arm before snarling some curses under his breath. "Piss off," he finally grumbled, picking up the pace and leaving them behind, choosing to walk with Bonnie and Mike instead. Clementine understood now why Troy was going off about being bitten, but it excused nothing. And honestly, his attitude had pissed her off. There was no reason to be mean to Sarah, or anyone really, though the younger girl had to admit she was a little protective of her friend. Still, it was nice to know that he wasn't completely stupid, and knew that if he laid a hand on anyone, he'd probably be left for dead immediately. "I didn't mean to make him feel bad," Sarah whispered, hugging her arms around her body. "I just thought he was being a little nicer. He just showed me how to use and hold a gun." "I think he's always going to be sourpuss," Clementine admitted with a shrug, "and he'll probably be moody like that too. I think he's learning how we function as a group too. Maybe once he adjusted better." Wait, what was she saying? It wasn't the idea to leave once he felt safe enough to do so. Once more cleared in her head, focusing on the environment. Once they left the substation area, there had been a few strings of wires and electrical towers, almost making a path for them to follow. Arvo had happened to be leading them that way too, making her wonder if the Russians had made a use of where they had kept and slept the previous night. It made sense, given the semi-fresh tracks leading into the snow to their campsite and towards their next destination. They were human footprints too, not walkers, judging by the steady patterns. Sarah and Clementine brought up to the rear of the group. Nick and Luke were walking in front of them with Mike, with AJ, Bonnie, Jane, and now Troy, more towards the front with Kenny, who just led behind Arvo. Everything surrounding them was now snows and trees, and the tundra forest that just made Clementine chilled from head to toe. Shivering, she bundled herself closer to bring the bright blue jacket, suddenly thankful to Bonnie for giving it back to her at Howe's. "You sure you're good?" Mike's voice made her lift her head, and she noticed that he was addressing to Luke. The younger man was still limping after all, leaning most of his weight onto Nick as they walked. "Yeah, I'm good. If I start to crap out, I'll let you know," Luke replied, wincing as they dragged along. "You could do that. That's no trouble, man," Mike assured, nodding to them. Kenny's voice sounded next from the other end of the front of the line. "How much fervor?" It didn't take a genius to figure out who he was talking to. "Close. Very close." Arvo seems to be talking through gritted his teeth, small whimpers leaving his lips as they walked. Though she couldn't see his face very well, the way he was standing made every step seem like an agony, and it was obvious he was holding in the pain. "You've been saying that shit every frickin' time he asks," Troy mumbled in irritation. "He has," Kenny agreed. "Maybe you and Rusky should start hanging out. Troy, you both of you seem like assholes who are useless without their little pals in charge." "Excuse the hell out of me?" Troy practically squawked, rage making his voice shake as he dashed up towards the older man. "You just watch your frickin' back, you old man. Too bad you only got one eye to do it with. Unless you want to make sorts open for bullets." Kenny snorted. "You all know about them handicaps, do you?" he snapped. "That's enough," Bonnie sighed exasperately. "Will you two just give it a rest? We get it. You don't like each other, and we can't do anything about that now. Except at least try to tolerate each other. For Clem, at least." She shook her head, the red hair ponytail bobbing back and forth like a horse's tail. The two of them were busy arguing. They didn't even notice the walker laying on the side of the rock as they passed it. Nick noticed it first, crying out, "Watch out! Lurker!" Before he could react, the walker was onto Kenny, tackling him to the ground and snapping the jaws for its bite of flesh. He cried out, fighting the predator, using all of his strength as he could to keep it at bay, arms prying the thing away from the torso. Clementine reached for her gun, but the premature shot sounded nearby, missing everyone completely and ringing in her ear. Sarah shakily held her own pistol, eyes wide as she realized how off her marks was. The weapon fell from her, and Clementine retrieved, aiming it for the walker's head. After that extra shot, the walker slumped onto Kenny, returning it back to the non-moving corpse it should have been. "But thanks, Clementine," Kenny huffed, standing up and brushing himself up. "That thing came out of nowhere." Clementine then let out a breath. She didn't even realize what she was holding. Exchanging a glance with Sarah, the older woman swallowed hard with the firm of tears over her eyes. Clementine shook her head with reassurance, handing back the pistol. "You didn't hesitate," she observed. "That was good. We just need to work on your aim a little more. You're still learning, so you're not going to hit your mark every time yet." With a trembling nod, Sarah wordlessly took her gun back, placing it in the safety way that Troy had showed her, and returning it to her belt. Once the blood had finally stopped roaring in her ears from the adrenaline, Clementine realized that AJ was crying, most likely because of the loud noises. Frowning, she wished she could do something to comfort him, but Mike was already bouncing him lightly in his arms, trying to soothe him as best he could. "Shh, it's okay, little guy," he said in a hushed tone to the infant. "It's just a gunshot. You'll hear plenty of does. Trust me." Luke chuckled. "If he's lucky, he'll find a place where he won't need to." "That sounds a bit too optimistic, so I gotta agree." Bonnie rolled her eyes. "Those gunshots were really loud. Hopefully there ain't more walkers." "Well, let's move. We don't want to be around to find out," Jane snapped, marching ahead. Arvo sighed, a defeated look shining in his eyes behind his glasses, and he muttered, "It's close, very close, come." He then continued to limp forward, clearly in pain, as he cursed quietly in Russian. Sarah nudged Clementine's side. "I hope Arvo's okay." With a nod, the younger girl replied, "Me too. I wish we had something to give him." "We don't have any more painkillers?" "No, I don't think so. We used the last of them on Troy and Rebecca. Maybe there'll be something at the house that he's taking us to, though." Clementine had hoped that he had been telling the truth, for his sake as much as theirs. After walking for a few more minutes, the trees finally stopped appearing, and Arvo stopped before a wide, white clearing. In the distance, a half-completed house could be seen, looking abandoned with half of the structure exposed to the cold. If sat on top of a hill, a long frozen lake stretched out between them and the house. Ice shimmered with a gust of wind tore right through the air. Snow from various clumps onto piled of blanks fluttering about. Clementine shivered, exchanging a glance with Sarah, who was a bit confused at the state of the house. Was that supposed to be a safe place for them? For AJ? It seemed like she wasn't the only one with doubts. "That piece of shit, you're taking us there?" Troy demanded, disbelief edging his tone. "I can't frickin' believe this. It's half-built. What good is that gonna do for us?" Kenny asked with a frustrated snarl. He shoved Arvo for good measure, the barrel of his gun pointed at the team's back. "You trying to frickin' play with us, kid?" Jane stepped up next. "We are here for the supplies," she reminded him, "not for the house." "It's warm," Arvo assured. "Very warm fireplace. Me and my family lived there for some time. Must be careful around ice." Unable to point with his hands bound, he nodded towards the frozen lake. Nick then raised an eyebrow in suspicion. "You want us just to walk over?" No one replied, and the group wordlessly walked to the edge of the frozen lake's bank, staring out into the icy surface, exchanging out for their destination. The frosty bridge seemed solid enough to walk on, though it was impossible to truly secure safety. Clementine swallowed hard, anxiously, gazing at the others. "There's no way around?" Bonnie questioned, and Arvo shook his head. It could take days to walk around," he replied softly. "Cannot find a clear path anyway." "Well, I guess we got no frickin' choice here. We gotta cross this," Kenny muttered in frustration. In the end, they all decided to spread out and not get clumped together, to keep their weight from breaking through the surface of the ice. Arvo was once again in front, leading them towards the frozen lake, with Kenny close behind him. Everyone else was separated as best they could, while still being within earshot. Clementine, Sarah, Nick, and Luke being the last one to walk out onto the ice. Kenny had demanded Arvo to go first, because he had been confident they could walk across just fine. The squeaks of the teen's leg brace were just only prompted to the sounds around them. save for the occasional gust of wind. The first step had been frightening, and Clementine almost went right then and there. But once she regained her balance, she was able to slowly step forward, following the rest of the group. Sarah nearly fallen as well, but started with a yelp and managed to keep herself standing. That's it, y'all. Just keep the weight spread out. Bonnie's encouraging sound came from up ahead, keeping Clementine focused on her goal. The adults were taking their time, so she made sure to follow their example. This was one area she didn't feel confident going off alone in ice. It was unpredictable, and science hadn't been her best subject. She kept her eyes on the ice, keeping watch for any cracks. She urged the closest to her as she did her do the same. Sarah nodded and whimpered, her anxiety clearly skyrocketing as her breaths became short and light. Sarah, try to keep it together, Nick murmured. Deep breaths, remember? The man looked extremely nervous as well, and didn't seem like he would be giving anyone advice at the moment. But the words connected nevertheless, for as long sighs escaped from Sarah's lips, her steps seemed slightly less wobbled as she followed nearby. Clementine could only keep a clear eye on her, even if though they weren't too close. She doubted her combined weight would break anything. It was also painstakingly slow, and each of the crunch of the boots of the ice made the tension for the air to grow thicker and thicker until it was too difficult to even think about but walking forward. 1 step, 2 steps, 3. Clementine decided to count each step, giving her something to focus on besides the fear of fissures and the ice running too deep. Once she counted 15 steps, she felt an unpleasantly cracking sound, and sure enough, the shape of the crevice around on its way to the ice below her. Spreading out erratically like a spider's web, she froze immediately. No sick pun intended, but her heart was skyrocketing rate at best. We're okay, Luke sounded from behind her, the shakiness of his voice despite himself. Don't worry. Nick's voice came up next. Keep moving. It's gonna be all right. We're almost there. Clementine then took a deep breath and pushed herself forward, going back to her mental counting. 16, 17, 18, and 19 animalistic snarls broke through the silence. The girl whipped her head around, seeing walkers furiously beginning to tread across the ice in pursuit for prey. Walkers! Sarah cried out, warning the rest of the group. Everyone turned their heads to look carefully, taking in the situation. It's only a few of them, Mike finally called back. We can make it. An angry shout from Kenny came up next. Hey, stay with us! After noticing the monsters following them, Arvo was walking a bit faster now. His quickened pace echoed in through faster squeaks of his brace. Behind her, Clementine heard the ice break and plunged something into the water underneath. A loud splash. Everyone stopped and stood still, almost bitterly frozen to their spot. Clearly afraid to look, Sarah whispered, Luke? Nick? It was some lurkers, Luke replied, sounding further away than he had been. Everyone seemed to be instantly regained their senses, and once more gazed behind of what would happen. The hole that the walkers had made wasn't very large, but it was clear that more of them had broken through. Some more breaks of the ice spread out from them and collapsed in their section, threatening to spread out where everyone was standing, and in the split-like coat of the frozen snow, keeping them alive. That's two less to deal with. Stay spread out, and we'll be fine, Jane said. Arvo didn't take those words to heart, however, because he broke into a fast sprint as he could manage, clumsily limping over towards the side of the lake. Kenny yelled curses after him, speeding up to him across the fragile surface. Time seemed to slow down as the older man sprinted like a cat chasing a mouse, after a boy who was currently mewing in pain as he ran. Shit, he's gonna kill him! Mike hissed angrily. Despite AJ being in his arms, he also decided to race forward, going after Kenny to try and stop his actions he might do in his rage. Get back here, you piece of shit! Kenny snarled. Just as Arvo glanced back at him, the boy cried out in agony and went tumbling down, the ice breaking in the water swallowing up the bottoms of his legs. The teen scrambled forward in desperation, his bound hands making it difficult to claw at the ice, but his good leg was kicking wildly to get out of the waters. Shivers already went through his body. Arvo screamed, to which Clementine could only assume meant no or a similar protest. Kenny grabbed him moments later and fished him out of the hole, dragging him to his feet and pushing him forward onto the snow on the other side of the lake. She let out a small sigh of relief, and moments later, after Kenny and Arvo, Mike and Bonnie had crossed to their safety at the other side as well, with Jane and Troy following them in return. With 6 of the members making it to safety, Clementine felt more confident, and the remaining 4 could cross as well. Clem, I'm scared, Sarah whimpered out under her breath, but a bit loud enough so they could hear. Luke, Nick, I'm really scared. Don't worry, Sarah. Like we said, we'll be fine, and we're gonna be fine, Nick assured, nerves practically keeping his words to a whisper. Go on ahead of us, Sarah. You're light enough to make it to the other side, no problem, and we'll follow shortly. Don't worry. Sarah exchanged a worried look at Clementine, but the younger girl merely signaled to hurry her pace. The older girl merely nodded, shakily, and stepped forward, making her at the lead of the group where they had left. She was currently at the closest to the other side, and it seemed to be focused on getting there in one piece. We got this, guys, Luke's murmured voice behind, but his voice not sounding confident. Clementine found herself nodding at the same time, though turned around to look at the 2 behind her, and she wished she hadn't. Nick was in front of Luke, closer to where Clementine was, but the latter man stopped completely, his limbs spread wide for balance. Cracks underneath like an earthquake had spread underneath his feet, instability keeping him from root of the ice. The fear of ripped through his face, his legs trembling beneath him, which only made the surface that made more unsafe. Clementine must have looked frightened at the sight, for Nick had caught her expression and turned around. His own stance began to wobble. Luke! He called out, turning around to go back for his friend. Stop! Luke's voice was full of terror, and that much was clear, but there was rawness that had cut through this fright, and truly showed desperate he was to keep Nick away. Don't come over here. Don't, Nick! His voice seemed to be begging for help, but he didn't want anyone to get near to share the same fate he would fall in. False confidence then settled in next, the brown-haired man then mumbling to himself, I can make it. It's fine. I'll be fine. I just need to get some time, okay? Give me a minute. Nick then shot his head. There's lurkers behind you. I'm not leaving you behind, man. Let me help. No, Luke snapped, a frantic panic effort to keep his friend away from danger. No, I can do this. I just gotta be careful. The moment he took a step forward, the ice crumbled beneath him, and his injured leg slipped through. Luke! Nick yelled, not hesitating to run for it. Oh, fuck, no, I'm coming, man! He hurried around, only to be stopped by his friend once more. If you get close, you're gonna fall in too, Luke said, shaking his head furiously. Do not get any closer. You too, Clem. Clementine hadn't even realized that she just turned back until she heard Luke's warning, stopping and planting herself on the spot that was covered with the least cracks just once. She looked back and pleased to see Sarah had made it to the other side safely. The older girl clearly wasn't happy, though, and almost walked back onto the ice, if it weren't for Bonnie grabbing and pulling her back. She was calling out their names in alarm, and that much was clear, but any other words were lost to Clementine, as the familiar rush of adrenaline began to course through her body. She then turned to complete her attention back to Luke, who was still practically in the water. You need help, Luke? Nick shouted, slowly inching towards him. No, you two will fall through if you get closer, Luke argued, trying all of his might to keep everyone away from him. When Clementine tried to dispute it, he cut her off and hissed, Don't you get it? I need you to shoot those lurkers for me, okay? That's all I need. A little more time. His eyes budged out and his fingers pinned to the surface of the ice, as if though the cold wasn't making him numb. Nick looked forward towards her in panic, equally palpable fear written all over his face. Clem, we have to help him. You're light and you can get to him, and I'll shoot. It's the only way I'll see us all making it to the other side. Clementine had no choice but to oblige, despite Luke's warnings. She cautiously stepped forward, ignoring his and the rest of the group's immediate protests. This was for his own sake, and she reflected. This was the only chance of survival. She wasn't going to let him die here. They had come so far, and Luke could not die like this. Nick's shots rang out through the air, drowning out some of the close to the walkers. The corpses fell onto the ice, surprisingly not breaking through where they lay. All the while, Clementine had tried to ignore the obvious threat she was walking towards and kept her focus on the panicked Luke, now halfway through the freezing water. Please, he begged through the bluish lips. Just go back. Get back to safety, Clem. No, you need help, Luke. I got you. She called back at him. It's gonna be all right. I'm scared. God, I'm so frickin' scared, Luke whispered to himself under his breath. Although he was trying to hide it from her, but she knew that he wasn't the unbreakable, and all was fronted himself as it is. Luke was human, and just like the rest of them, and he needed someone to help them. You need help, she repeated louder, this time as she inched forward. I need help, he echoed, banging his head. God, you're right. Shit, I'm sorry. Please, Clem, help me. It must have felt nice to really admit that. Clementine had reflected. But if it wasn't relieving, it probably would have been embarrassing for him. But it didn't matter either way, because she wasn't going to give up on him. Deciding she couldn't quite concentrate on the way his body dropped miserably where she was staring at the ice, she opted to count her steps again. 1, 2, 3. Before she could even get to 5, a horribly loud crunch sounded. The area below Luke broke through, swallowing him whole. Clementine stared at the spot where the ice had caved in, her eyes growing wider with every damn millisecond that Luke was not there. He wasn't there anymore. He just crumpled there, waiting for someone to rescue him or time to run out, or perhaps either. But now it was not. It took a few seconds for her to process that Luke was simply gone, and she had failed him so terribly. She had failed him.